Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. He arrived late in the evening, long after the sun had gone down behind the highway. The hotel stood alone at the edge of town, an old brick building with narrow windows and a slanted roof that looked older than it probably was. The neon sign flickered in and out, buzzing softly, casting a pale red glow over the empty parking lot. He was tired after a long day of driving and just wanted a warm bed and a quiet place to sleep. Inside, the hotel lobby wasn't much to look at. The faded wallpaper peeled slightly at the corners, the overhead lights hummed, and the carpet had the kind of pattern that seemed designed to hide stains. Still, it was welcoming enough. Behind the front desk stood a middle-aged woman with a calm but tired expression, as if she had explained the same rules to people countless times before. "Checking in?" she asked, offering a faint smile. "Yes, reservation under Carter," he replied. She found his name, handed him a key attached to a brass tag, and slid a form across the counter. After he signed it, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. Something in her expression changed, just slightly, but enough that he noticed. "There's something I should tell you," she said. "On your floor, as you walk to your room, you'll pass a door with no number. It's locked. Nobody is allowed inside, ever." He blinked, unsure if she was joking. "All right," he said slowly. She leaned forward just a little. Don't try to open it," she continued. "Most importantly, do not look inside, under any circumstances." Her tone was serious enough to make him straighten up. People say odd things in small towns, but something about the way she said it made his skin prickle. "Okay," he said again. "I won't." She nodded like she had heard that response before, and it hadn't always been true. He took the key, thanked her, and headed toward the elevator. The hallway on the third floor was dim, lined with old paintings of forests and lakes. As he walked, he noticed the door immediately. It stood out, even though it didn't look unusual at first glance. No number, no plaque, just a plain white door in a row of numbered ones. Still, something felt off about it, like it didn't belong there, like the hallway bent around it in a way he couldn't see. He didn't slow down, he didn't touch it. He went straight to his room and set his luggage down with relief. After washing up and changing into comfortable clothes, he let himself fall into bed. The mattress was soft, and the quiet hum of the air conditioner lulled him into a heavy sleep. The next night, however, things changed. He tried to ignore the whispering curiosity that kept brushing the back of his mind. The strange door kept returning to his thoughts, its blank surface, its quiet presence. It was as if it called to him, not loudly, but insistently, like a thought that won't go away. By late evening, he gave in. He opened his room door and stepped into the hallway, which was dimmer than usual. A few lights flickered softly. Everything felt slightly colder. He walked toward the door with no number. When he reached it, he saw that the handle was old and slightly tarnished, as though it had been touched by many hands long ago, but rarely in recent years. He tried the knob gently. It didn't budge. It was completely locked. He hesitated, remembering the woman's warning. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, especially when it has been denied. He bent down slowly, bringing his eye toward the wide, old-fashioned keyhole. A faint draft brushed against his face. The air that seeped through was ice cold, sending a shiver straight through him. He looked. At first he expected darkness, but instead he saw a room almost identical to his own. Same wallpaper, same furniture arrangement, same faint glow from the lamp in the corner. But there, in the far corner of the room, stood a woman. Her skin was white, not pale, not fair, white like porcelain, like someone drained of all color. She stood absolutely still, her back to him, her forehead resting against the wall as if she were listening to something inside it. Her long hair hung down her back, also strangely lacking any color. She wore a gown that seemed old-fashioned, loose around her thin shoulders. He froze. His breath caught in his throat as he stared, trying to understand what he was seeing. There was something wrong about her stillness, something unnatural. He couldn't see her face, but he felt the weight of her presence, heavy and cold. After several seconds that felt much longer, he pulled away from the keyhole. For a moment he almost raised his hand to knock. Maybe she needed help, maybe she was hurt. But something deep inside him stopped him. A primal instinct, a warning louder than his curiosity. He backed away slowly, heart pounding, and returned to his room. He barely slept. His dreams were full of cold air and white shapes, standing in the corners of unfamiliar rooms. The next day he tried to shake it off. It must have been some kind of illusion, a trick of the light, or maybe he was seeing reflections through the tiny opening. He told himself that over and over, though none of the explanations really satisfied him. By evening he found himself standing in front of the door again. He didn't want to look. He knew he shouldn't. But that same strange pull drew him closer. He bent down again. Where he had seen a room the night before, he now saw only red. A flat, solid field of deep red. No shapes, no depth, no movement. Just a red so vivid it almost hurt to look at. He blinked, leaned back, and looked again. Still red. It didn't make sense. Maybe they had covered the keyhole from the inside. Put something in front of it, hung a cloth, moved furniture. But why red? Why so perfectly, uniformly red? His heart beat faster as he straightened up. Something inside him understood what had happened, even though he didn't yet have the words for it. Someone, or something, knew he had looked. He walked away, feeling the cold air follow him down the hallway. When he could no longer stand the uncertainty, he went down to the lobby. The woman at the front desk looked up from her paperwork. Her expression changed instantly when she saw his face. "You looked through the keyhole," she said flatly. He swallowed. I did. I'm sorry, what is that room? Who is in there?" She sighed heavily, as if she had been expecting this moment, as if she had seen it unfold the same way many times before. "I suppose I should tell you the story," she said. Her voice was calm but heavy, as though she carried a burden that never lightened. A long time ago, a married couple stayed in that room. They weren't ordinary people. They were different. Their skin was white, all of it. White like chalk. They almost didn't look human. But their eyes... She paused, her voice dropping. Their eyes were red. He felt the breath go out of him. "One night," she continued, "the man murdered his wife in that room. No one knows why. Some say he went mad. Others say he was never sane to begin with. But the story goes that her spirit never left. She stays in that room, standing in the corner with her face to the wall, as if she's eternally listening for him. And she doesn't like to be watched. Especially not through the keyhole." He remembered the cold air, the motionless figure, the perfect whiteness of her skin. He remembered the solid red he saw the next day. "Red," he whispered. His voice trembled before he even realized it. "I saw red today. The whole keyhole. Red." The woman nodded slowly. "That wasn't the room being blocked," she said quietly. That was her eye. He felt the world tilt beneath him as the meaning sank in. She had been standing on the other side of the door, watching him watch her. She knew. And the cold that followed him back to his room that night felt different than simple fear. It felt aware. I grew up in a very small town in northern Ontario, the kind of place people don't usually visit unless they have family there or they're passing through on their way to somewhere else. If you blinked while driving, you could miss it entirely. The houses were spaced far apart, separated by long stretches of gravel road and thick walls of forest that felt endless when you were a kid. In winter, the cold settled into your bones and stayed there. Snow would pile up past the windows, and the air had a sharpness that made your lungs ache. Summers were short and green and bright, but even then the woods always felt deeper than they should have been. When I think about those years now, it feels like looking through frosted glass. I can see shapes and hear echoes, but I can't step back into it. I'm 22 now, living in Texas, where the heat feels constant and the sky stretches wide without trees blocking the horizon. But no matter how far I move, one memory from that small town stays with me in a way the others don't. It's clear, sharp, and it still makes my skin prickle when I think about it too long. When I was 5 or 6, the highlight of my week was Friday nights at Jeanette and Emil's house. They lived a few doors down from us, close enough that my mom could walk me there in the summer and pull me on a sled in the winter. Their house always felt warmer than ours, not just temperature-wise, but in the way it held people. Why, it smelled like fresh bread, old wood, and whatever Jeanette was cooking that evening. There was always something simmering on the stove. The kitchen was the heart of the place. It was crowded and bright, with mismatched chairs around a big round table that had scratches and dents from years of use. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, and the overhead light cast a soft yellow glow over everything. Adults would gather there every Friday, neighbors, family, friends. The same small group of people whose voices I knew by heart. They would talk and laugh and share gossip about the town, about who bought new snow tires, who got a new job at the mill, who was sick. I was the only kid on the block. There were no other children my age close by, so I didn't stay in the kitchen long. The grown-ups would settle in with coffee or beer, and I would drift off to one of the 2 guest bedrooms upstairs with my books, my stuffed bear, or whatever toy I had brought along. I would play quietly until I got tired enough to fall asleep. Later, my mom would carry me home, wrapped in a blanket, half aware of the cold air hitting my face, before I was tucked into my own bed. That was the routine. It never changed. Until one night, it did. I remember lying in one of the guest beds, staring at the ceiling. The house felt safe. The hum of adult conversation drifted up the stairs, soft and steady. I could hear forks clinking against plates, chairs scraping lightly against the floor, someone laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't that funny. It was all background noise I was used to. It meant everything was normal. I held my stuffed bear close and waited for sleep. That's when I heard it. At first, it blended into the rest of the noise, a thin, trembling sound that didn't quite fit. I thought maybe someone was clearing their throat or a chair was squeaking. But then it came again, longer this time, sharper. It was crying. Not loud, not screaming, just a weak, steady cry, a baby. I pushed myself up on my elbows and listened harder. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the adults downstairs. It was inside the house, close. I knew every voice in that kitchen. There were no babies in our neighborhood, no one with a newborn. The nearest house was too far away for sound to travel clearly like that, especially through the woods and snow. The crying continued, thin, sad, repeating. I slid off the bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I clutched my bear and stepped into the hallway. The upstairs felt darker than usual, the corners holding more shadow than I remembered. The crying didn't stop. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The kitchen doorway glowed warm with light. The adults were still talking, unaware of what I was hearing. I tugged on my mom's sleeve and told her I couldn't sleep because a baby was crying upstairs. Now, she barely looked down at me. She was mid-conversation, smiling politely at someone across the table. She gave me a gentle pat and said, "It's probably just the pipes, honey. Go back to bed." I didn't argue. I wasn't a difficult kid, but I knew what I heard. Before I could turn away, Jeanette looked at me. There was something in her expression that I didn't understand at the time. It wasn't surprise, it wasn't confusion. It was softer than that. Sadder. She stood up slowly. She walked to the counter and opened the cookie jar. She pulled out a chocolate chip cookie and handed it to me. "Why don't you go watch TV in the living room, sweetheart?" she said gently. I nodded, grateful for the treat, and walked into the living room. It sat right beside the kitchen, separated by a partial wall. I turned the TV on low, but I didn't really watch it. I sat on the couch with my cookie in my hand, listening. The crying had stopped. The adults' voices lowered. Someone asked Jeanette what made me think I heard a baby. There was a pause before she answered, a long one. "When we first moved here," she began slowly, "there was a cross hanging in the guest room upstairs." Her voice sounded different than usual, less casual, more careful. "We're not religious people," she continued, "but the old owners left a lot of stuff behind. Crosses, pictures, all kinds of things on the walls. We took it all down." I could hear someone stirring their coffee, the small metal spoon scraping against the mug. "Our bedroom's in the basement," she said, "closer to the heater. The guest rooms are upstairs. We used to hear things up there." "Like what?" someone asked. "Footsteps," she replied. "Running, light steps, like a kid playing." A few people laughed softly. "Probably the dog," someone said. "Or the cat," another added. "That's what we thought," Jeanette said. Her voice tightened slightly. "But one weekend, Emile took the dogs hunting. Man, the cat wouldn't come inside that night." She let that settle. "I was home alone," she went on, "downstairs reading, and I heard it again, clear as day, running upstairs." The kitchen grew quieter. "I knew the house was empty except for me," she said, "so I went upstairs to check." Her voice dropped lower. "And that's when I heard the baby." Even at 5 years old, I felt something shift in the room. The adults weren't laughing anymore. "It wasn't outside," she said. "It wasn't the neighbors. It was inside my house." Someone whispered, "Oh my God." "I checked every room," she continued. "Every closet, every corner. The crying wouldn't stop. It sounded close, but I couldn't find it." I imagined her walking down the hallway alone, the house dark around her. "I got scared," she admitted. "I didn't know what else to do, so I called the police." The OPP sent 2 officers, a younger one and an older man who'd been on the force for years. They searched the house from top to bottom. By the time they arrived, the crying had stopped. They found nothing, but the older officer had looked around differently, not casually, like he recognized something. "I remember this house," he said. Jeanette had asked him what he meant. He said he'd been called here 3 years before, when the Harrisons lived here. The room was silent. Their toddler was found dead in its crib. I remember hearing a fork hit the table. The officer had suggested gently but firmly that maybe they should put the cross back up in the guest room. Jeanette didn't argue. She had found the small wooden cross in a drawer and hung it exactly where it had been. After that, she said, the footsteps stopped. The crying stopped. She never heard it again. The adults eventually returned to their regular conversation, but something had changed. Their laughter sounded thinner, their voices more careful. Not long after, my mom told me it was time to go home. She walked upstairs to gather my things from the guest room. I stayed in the living room, hugging my bear, staring at the dark hallway that led upstairs. When she came back down, her face looked strange. Not scared, not exactly, uneasy. She didn't say anything until we were back home, until she had helped me out of my boots and taken off my jacket. "You know that cross Jeanette talked about?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "When you were playing earlier, you must have knocked it off the wall." She said she found it lying on the floor beside the bed I had been using. My stomach twisted even then. I didn't remember touching it. I didn't remember seeing it at all. But I was 5. I could have bumped it, pulled on it, thrown a toy too hard. That was the night I heard the baby crying. That was the night the adults' voices grew tense. That was the night the house felt different. I didn't fully understand why that small wooden cross mattered so much. I still don't know what to believe, but something about the timing sits wrong with me. Jeanette had said the crying stopped after she put it back up. But that night, it had been on the floor, and I was the only one upstairs. We moved away a few years later. Life continued. School, friends, college, Texas, heat instead of snow. But every now and then, especially late at night, I think about that house. I think about the footsteps Jeanette heard when she was alone. I think about the officer who remembered the crib. I think about the way Jeanette looked at me when I said I heard a baby. And sometimes when the house I live in now is quiet, when the air conditioner clicks off and the silence settles heavy in the room, I lie still and listen. Every once in a while, just at the edge of hearing, I catch something that makes my breath slow, a thin, distant cry, soft, sad, steady, not loud enough to prove, not clear enough to deny, and it never quite feels like it's coming from far away. A couple of years back, some friends and I decided we were overdue for a long break from work. We all had vacation time saved up, and one night, after too many tired jokes and too many complaints about bosses and deadlines, someone tossed out the idea of taking a 2-week road trip across several states. Start in the southeast, drive up through Pennsylvania, loop back down. Nothing fancy, no hotels unless we had to. Just a car, tents, and the kind of loose plan that feels perfect when you're young enough to think fatigue is a small price for freedom. We fell into a routine almost immediately. We'd drive through the night, trading off seats and playlists, stopping at gas stations that all looked the same, eating whatever we could grab with one hand and swallow without choking. Then, sometime before dusk or just after dawn, we'd find somewhere to pitch our tents. The goal wasn't to camp in the romantic sense. We weren't doing campfires and marshmallows and making memories under the stars. We were sleeping. That was it. We wanted to lie flat for a few hours without being folded into a back seat like laundry. We'd crash hard, wake up when the sun got too hot or our bodies finally refused to stay asleep, pack up fast and spend the day exploring whatever area we happened to be in. Sometimes it was a city, sometimes it was a state park, sometimes it was a roadside attraction we'd never heard of until a sign showed up in the headlights. It was exhausting and it was fun, and it made time feel stretched out in a way it never does when you're living the same week over and over. By the time we drove into Alabama, the trip still felt like an adventure. If you've ever driven Alabama's interstate north to south, you know how repetitive it can be. Trees, more trees, the same green wall on both sides, broken only by exits, billboards, and the occasional patch of open land. It's the kind of drive that makes your brain go soft, like your thoughts start to drift because there's nothing to grab onto. We didn't want that. We wanted the trip to feel like it was moving through places, not just between them. So we routed ourselves off the interstate and onto rural roads, smaller highways, back roads, the kind of routes that aren't straight lines on the map, that force you to pay attention. Fields, dirt, gravel, little towns with one blinking traffic light and a handful of cars parked outside a diner. We were about 3/4 of the way up the state when we decided to stop and rest for the morning. The sun was already up, but our brains were cooked from driving all night. That feeling had settled in where you're awake, but not really. You're holding onto the steering wheel and realizing you've been staring through the windshield for 10 miles without remembering a single detail of the road. It was time to stop before someone did something stupid. We found a huge open field that looked, at first glance, like nothing and no one owned it. Soft green grass. No fences, no posted signs, no trespassing, no cattle, no farmhouse in sight. Just wind, sky, and a wide stretch of land that felt empty in the clean, harmless way empty places sometimes do in daylight. We pulled over. We set up the tents fast without even really talking. Everybody moved like they were on autopilot. The air smelled like warm grass and sun. Birds were loud in the distance. Everything looked safe enough, peaceful enough, and we were too tired to be picky. Then we crashed. Some of us slept inside tents, some outside on sleeping pads, and one friend didn't even bother unrolling anything. She just used her jacket as a pillow and passed out like she'd been unplugged. I remember lying there, half awake, hearing the faint rustle of grass in the breeze, and feeling that deep relief of finally not being in motion. When we woke around noon, it was bright and warm, the kind of midday light that makes everything look sharper than it should. The field was even prettier in full sun. The grass glowed. The air was clear. Somewhere far away, a tractor moved like a slow insect. It felt like we'd found a hidden pocket of calm in the middle of our chaotic trip. That's when we noticed the barn. It was about 500 feet away, sitting at the edge of the field like it belonged on a postcard. Red paint, clean lines, white trim catching the sunlight. A roof that looked new enough to still be proud of itself. It didn't look run down or abandoned. It looked cared for, like someone had built it with intention, even if they didn't come out to greet us. Someone joked about it looking like a movie set. Someone else said we should go take pictures because it was the kind of thing you don't stumble across every day. We were in that mood where the smallest novelty feels exciting because you're tired and far from home. We packed up, loaded the car, and walked across the field toward the barn. As we got closer, it kept looking clean. Not just not abandoned, but oddly perfect. The boards were straight. The paint wasn't peeling. The doors looked heavy and solid. There were no weeds choking the base. No old junk piled in front. Even the air around it felt still, like it didn't want to be disturbed by the wind rolling across the grass. We spread out when we got there. That's what groups do. No one said, "Stay together," because it was a barn in daylight, a harmless thing, a photo op. Half of my friends wandered toward the big doorway, peering inside. Another friend circled around the back. I drifted toward the side where taller grass grew, around a few pieces of rusted farm equipment. Old metal shapes half buried in green, sun-warmed and quiet. I remember thinking how strange it was that the equipment looked so old and the barn looked so new, like they came from different decades and someone had shoved them into the same scene. Then I heard my friend yelling from inside the barn. It wasn't playful. It wasn't her calling out for us to come see something cool. It was sharp, urgent, and it echoed off the wooden walls in a way that made the sound feel trapped. I jogged around the corner and went in. Two of my other friends were already there with her. All three of them were standing near the back, clustered around a square section of the floor. At first, I thought it was just a patch of different wood. Then I saw the hinges, a trapdoor, a big one, thick wood reinforced with metal. The kind of thing you'd expect in an old root cellar or some farmhouse horror story, not in a barn that looked like it had been built yesterday. It didn't fit. That was the first thought that hit me. This doesn't belong here. My friend, the one who'd yelled, was pale. She was staring down at the trapdoor like she expected it to breathe. "I heard crying," she whispered. The sentence landed hard in the quiet barn. "What?" someone said. "A kid." she said, voice tight, like a child crying. It came from right here. I walked over and then it stopped. We all stood there in a tight little group, these suddenly listening like our ears had become more important than our eyes. Nothing, no crying, no movement, no voice, just the slow creak of the barn settling and the faint sound of wind slipping through cracks. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to suggest an animal, a fox, a cat, something trapped under the floor. But the barn felt wrong in a way that made jokes stick in my throat. The air inside was cooler than it should have been, and it smelled faintly of old dust and something sour, like something that reminded me of damp wood left too long. I opened my mouth to say we should go, or at least call someone. I didn't get a word out. A massive crash slammed against the underside of the trap door. The sound was so violent it felt like it came up through the soles of my shoes. The door shuddered. Dust puffed out around the edges. All three of my friends screamed at the same time and ran. They didn't hesitate. They didn't think. They just bolted toward the doorway as if the barn had suddenly become a burning building. And I didn't move. I don't know why. That part still embarrasses me, even now. My brain knew what to do, run. But my body didn't listen. My legs locked. My arms went numb. I stood there staring at the trapdoor as if staring could hold it shut. My heart was beating so hard it made my vision pulse at the edges. My instincts were screaming at me to turn and go. Every part of me was begging for movement. And then, just as suddenly, my body snapped out of it like a rubber band whipping back into place. One moment I was frozen. The next I spun to run so fast it felt like my joints lagged behind. My foot lifted to take the first step, and the world went black. Not fainting black, not my eyes closed black. Black like something covered me. It felt exactly like a heavy blanket being thrown over my head, thick and suffocating, cutting off light instantly. I couldn't see my hands. I couldn't see the floor. I couldn't even tell if my eyes were open or shut because there was no difference. And then the screaming started, a child's scream, loud, piercing, endless. It wasn't far away. It wasn't muffled by wood. It was right there, everywhere at once, next to my ear, above my head, inside the space of my skull. It didn't rise and fall like a real scream. It didn't take a breath. It just continued. And one long, unbroken shriek that should have been impossible for any lungs to hold. I think I screamed too. I'm not sure. I couldn't hear myself. My own body was just a trembling thing under that black weight. Something cold pressed against my chest. Not the chill of air. Not the cold of fear. It felt like contact. Like a small hand made of ice had reached through my ribs and wrapped around my heart. The cold tightened, squeezing, and each second it became harder to breathe. My lungs worked, but it felt like the air wasn't doing anything, like I was inhaling and nothing was reaching where it needed to go. I started thrashing, wildly, blindly swinging my arms through the dark, trying to hit whatever was on me, whatever was holding me. I couldn't see what I was fighting. I couldn't hear anything but that scream. The only thing I could do was struggle like an animal in a trap. Nothing gave. The cold tightened again, and panic became absolute. My legs stumbled forward. I forced myself into motion because standing still felt like dying. I ran without knowing where the doorway was. I ran without knowing if I was running into a wall, and then impact. A hard wooden slam that exploded across my forehead. It wasn't like the world faded, it snapped off, like a light switch. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying in the grass next to our car. The sun was still bright, stabbing my eyes. My head throbbed with a deep, pulsing pain that seemed to match my heartbeat. My left eye was sealed shut because dried blood had glued it closed. When I reached up, my fingers came away sticky. There was a cut across my forehead, deep enough that the skin around it felt swollen and wrong. All three of my friends were sitting nearby, close together but not touching. No one was talking. No one was looking at the sky or laughing or doing anything normal. They looked hollow, like someone had scooped something out of them. Their faces were pale. Their eyes were fixed on nothing. When they saw me move, they flinched as if they'd forgotten I was a person and not an object. One of them rushed forward and helped me sit up carefully, hands shaking. Someone handed me a bottle of water. Another friend held a wad of napkins from the car. Their movements were stiff, cautious, like they were afraid of making the wrong noise. I rinsed the blood off my face as best I could, blinking my good eye hard, trying to get the world to stop spinning. I used the little first aid kit we kept for road blisters and scraped knees, and I wrapped a bandage around my forehead. It wasn't enough, but it was something. When I finally asked what happened, my voice sounded thin, like it belonged to someone else. They looked at each other reluctant, like saying it out loud might make it real again. They told me they had run back to the car and were ready to leave when they realized I wasn't with them. At first, they thought I'd run out behind them and gone a different direction. Then they realized the barn was quiet, too quiet. They tried the car doors, locked. I had the keys. They couldn't get in. They couldn't even start the car. They stood there in the field, arguing in panicked whispers about what to do. One of them wanted to run toward town and call the police. Another wanted to go back to the barn. None of them wanted to be the one to do it. Then they said they heard my screaming, not from the field, from the barn. It wasn't a normal scream, they told me. It was frantic and ragged, like someone being hurt, like someone losing their mind. And it was coming from inside that building they'd just fled. They admitted they didn't want to go back. They were terrified. They kept waiting for the scream to stop, hoping it would, hoping I'd come running out behind it. But it didn't stop, so they went back in. They said the barn looked wrong even then, like the light inside wasn't the same, like the air was thicker, like it had shifted while they were gone. They found me lying on the floor, unconscious, and the trapdoor was open, wide open. They told me that detail like it hurt to say, like it burned their tongues. They wouldn't describe what they saw below. Every time I tried to ask, one of them would shake their head quickly, eyes glossy, and look away. They said they didn't go near my head or my chest because that meant standing with their backs to the open door. So they grabbed me by my ankles and dragged me. They dragged me across the barn floor, out the doorway, across the field, and back to the car. The whole time, they said, the hair on the back of their necks was standing up, like something was watching them from behind. When they finished, they sat there in the grass and waited for me to wake up because none of them knew what else to do. I lay there trying to fit their words into my memory, trying to line up the blackness and the scream and the impact with the idea of a trapdoor standing open. My stomach turned so hard I thought I might throw up. Then one of them told me to turn around and look. I didn't want to. I already knew in that sick, intuitive way that whatever I saw would lock the day into place forever. I turned anyway. The barn was different. The bright red wood was gone. The clean lines were gone. The white trim was gone. In its place stood a rotting, sagging structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof dipped in the middle. The boards were gray and splintered. The windows were broken. The doorway looked like a mouth missing teeth. It wasn't picturesque anymore. It was exhausted, collapsing, and wrong. It looked like the barn we had walked into had never existed, or like it had existed for a moment, just long enough to draw us in. When I turned back to my friends, they were staring at me with blank, exhausted faces. Not disbelief, not confusion, just the look of people who have seen something they can't place anywhere in their understanding of the world. No one said anything after that. There was nothing left to say. I handed my keys to one friend without a word. I climbed into the car carefully, head pounding. a bandage already soaking through in spots. I didn't ask to go to a hospital. I didn't ask to call anyone. I just wanted distance. I wanted the road. I wanted the world to go back to being ordinary, even if it was boring. Drive, I said, and they did. We didn't stop until we were miles away. We didn't stop for gas. We didn't stop for food. We didn't stop until the landscape changed enough that it felt like we had escaped whatever pocket of unreality we'd stumbled into. For the rest of the trip, we never camped in open fields again. Only real campgrounds, places with signs and bathrooms and other people. Or we slept in the car. We didn't explore barns. We didn't poke around abandoned structures. We didn't follow curiosities down quiet roads just because the day was pretty and we were bored. And we never talked about it. Not that day, not the next day, not when we got home, not in texts, not in jokes. Not in late-night conversations when people usually confess the things they've been carrying. It was like we all understood, without saying it, that speaking about it would invite it back into our lives, that we had gotten out once and pushing our luck would be a mistake. Even now, when I think about that field and that barn, the part that unsettles me most isn't the trap door or the scream or the way I woke up bleeding in the grass. It's how quickly the world changed shape. How easily a place can look harmless in the sun, and how sometimes the worst thing you can do on a road trip is stop somewhere that looks too open, too quiet, too free. I grew up with the supernatural shoved in my face so often that it stopped being mysterious and started being embarrassing. My mother drank, and when she drank, she would talk about spirits the way other people talk about the weather. Our house always smelled faintly sour, like old wine soaked into carpet, and her voice would float through rooms at odd hours, telling stories about energies and messages and invisible presences that were supposedly trying to get her attention. As a kid, I learned early that when she said she saw something, it might mean she saw something, or it might mean her brain was slipping sideways because she'd been drinking since lunch. She would stare at corners too long. She would pause mid-sentence and tilt her head like she was listening to someone else. Sometimes she would get angry at things that weren't there. Other times she'd cry because she claimed someone dead was standing in the hallway and she missed them. It didn't feel magical. It felt unstable. So I went the opposite direction as hard as I could. I became hostile toward it, not because I'd never heard ghost stories, but because I'd heard too many. I associated every mention of the paranormal with chaos and excuses. If my mother said she heard a voice, it usually meant she didn't want to talk about what she'd done. If she said something wasn't right in the house, it usually meant she'd broken something and needed a reason that wasn't her fault. By the time I hit my teens, I was sick of it. I wanted hard facts. I wanted things you could measure. I wanted the world to be a place where a sound had a source, and a shadow had an object, and fear had a reason you could point at. When my mother started in on spirits, I would roll my eyes so aggressively it was almost theatrical. I made jokes. I shut her down. I took pride in the idea that I couldn't be fooled. That's why what happened later still makes me feel stripped bare, even now. It didn't just scare me, it took something from me. It forced me to live with the thought that reality has seams you don't see until they split. This was about 10 years ago when I was a teenager, and my confidence was mostly just ignorance dressed up as certainty. I had a close friend, one of those friendships you get at that age where you're together so often you start to feel like you share one brain. We were the kind of boys who thought we were deep. We would walk for hours, talking about politics, society, the future, the way adults were all asleep at the wheel and we were somehow the only ones who could see it. It makes me cringe now, but at the time it felt like purpose. It felt like we were sharpening ourselves against each other, getting ready for the world. One of our regular routes cut through a park on the way back to his house. We used it because it was a shortcut when we were pushing curfew, but we also used it because it was beautiful in the daytime. People jogged there, people walked their dogs. It ran along water and skirted the edge of a gorge. In daylight, it was scenic and open and calm. At night, it became something else. If you've never walked through a wooded park after dark, it's hard to explain the particular way your brain reacts. Even if you know houses are nearby, even if you know the city is only minutes away, the trees change the scale of everything. Sound gets swallowed, light gets trapped. The world narrows down to what you can see right in front of you, and what you can't see becomes its own presence. This park wasn't a neat little city garden with lamp posts and flower beds. It was a strip of wilderness cutting through the suburbs. The main trail was a long paved path known as the Galloping Goose Trail, well used, familiar. Branching off from it was a smaller curved path that circled a small inlet along the gorge. The water there wasn't loud like a river, but it had constant motion, a low, steady sound that never fully stopped. It made the air feel colder, and it made you feel watched, even when you told yourself you weren't. As you walked up the hill on that smaller path, the streetlights from the main trail stopped abruptly. 1 minute you were in that soft orange glow, and the next, you stepped into the woods where the lights didn't reach. There was one light post farther up the hill, standing alone, like someone had placed it there out of habit and then forgotten to continue. Beyond that single light, the path climbed into thicker trees, crested over the hill, and wound back down. There was also a break in the trees at one point where you could see a house. It wasn't right up against the path, but it was visible through the branches, like something peering back. It looked old and wrong, the kind of place you notice even in daylight and then forget about, because you don't want to linger on it. It didn't fit with the rest of the neighborhood. It looked like it belonged in a different decade. In the dark, it was just a shape, but it carried a weight that made your eyes slide away from it. On the night that changed everything, my friend and I were walking that route like we always did. We were mid-conversation, arguing about something we thought mattered. We were moving uphill, right toward the point where the lit path ended and the trees thickened. As we approached the lone streetlight up the hill, it flickered. Not a gentle flicker, not the way a bulb sometimes pulses when it's dying, but a hard stutter like a throat clearing. Then it went completely black. If you've ever watched a streetlight die at the exact moment you're beneath it, you know the feeling. It's small, but it hits something primitive. You suddenly become aware of the dark around you. Like it was waiting politely, and now it's allowed to step closer. At the time, I did what I always did. I shrugged it off. Old infrastructure, bad timing, coincidence. I didn't even slow down. We stepped out of the last pool of light and into the woods proper, and our conversation kept going, because we were teenagers and we believed our thoughts were more powerful than the environment. We crested the hill and started down the other side. The air was cold. The trees were still. The only sound was our shoes crunching over gravel and the faint movement of water down by the gorge. Then the noise hit. It didn't creep in. It didn't build. It arrived fully formed, impossibly loud, like a wall dropping in front of us. It was so loud, it had weight. That sounds dramatic, but that's the only way to describe it. It pressed against my chest. It made my teeth ache. It wasn't just heard, it was felt, like standing too close to a speaker at a concert. Except there was no speaker. There was only trees and darkness. My brain reacted the way it always did. It grabbed for an explanation. I told myself it was a helicopter. A helicopter flying low over the gorge would make sense. Rotors could make that kind of pounding roar, and maybe the sound was bouncing weirdly off the trees and water. For a few seconds, that explanation worked just enough to keep my body from running. I clung to it like a handle. Then it got closer, and instead of becoming clearer in a mechanical way, it became clearer in a human way. The roar wasn't coming from above. There was no downwash, no wind, no movement in the tree branches. The trees were still silhouettes against the night sky. Everything in the woods looked frozen. The sound, however, was moving. It surrounded us, and then it separated. There were voices in it. Not one voice, not a couple, not a group of teenagers messing around somewhere nearby. It was too many. It sounded like hundreds, maybe thousands. They layered on top of each other, speaking and whispering and screaming all at once. It wasn't language I could pick out, not in the way you can catch words across a field. It was the sound of a crowd in panic, a mass of human noise, distorted and chaotic, like a stadium full of people all screaming different things at the same time. I remember the feeling of my stomach dropping, not because I was suddenly afraid of ghosts, but because my brain couldn't hold the sound in any logical box anymore. A helicopter doesn't whisper. A helicopter doesn't scream with human voices. A helicopter doesn't sound like terror. My friend stopped walking. I stopped too. We stood there in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, paralyzed. In that moment, I could feel the heat of my own skin, the cold air around it, and the way my body was trying to decide whether to fight or run. There was nothing to look at. There was no shape charging through the trees. There was only sound all around us. Like the woods had become a throat. The worst part was that it didn't sound like a warning meant to scare us off. It sounded like something happening again, like we were standing inside an echo that didn't care if we were there. Then, as strangely as it began, it drifted away. Not in a fading, it's stopping way, but in a moving, it's leaving way. The wall of voices traveled through the trees, getting quieter as it went, like a storm moving off across a field. It pulled away from us and vanished into the night, and what was left behind was silence so thick it felt like my ears were ringing. My friend and I looked at each other in the darkness. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. There are moments where words feel childish, too small to carry what just happened. We turned around at the exact same time and started walking back the way we came. We weren't running. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear that if we ran, we'd admit how powerless we were. But we walked fast. Our bodies were stiff. Our eyes stayed forward. Neither of us looked into the trees. It felt like if we turned our heads, something would be waiting right there, inches from our faces. When we reached the main road again, under real streetlights with cars passing and houses sitting quietly behind their yards, I finally felt my muscles unlock. And instead of relief, I felt anger. Not anger at my friend. Not anger at the park. Anger at the fact that fear had touched me in a way I couldn't control. I was used to being able to fight fear with logic, to talk myself out of it, to laugh at it. But that night there had been nothing to fight. You can't punch a sound. You can't argue with something that doesn't present itself as a thing. The helplessness was the horror. I asked my friend if he heard it too, because I needed to know I wasn't insane. He didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly, face pale beneath the streetlights. His expression wasn't theatrical or excited, like someone who'd just experienced a spooky story. He looked sick, like his body had registered something his mind didn't want. That was the moment I knew this wasn't my mother's world of drunken claims. This was something outside us. In the days after, we did what teenagers do when they're scared and don't want to stay scared. We tried to solve it. We told ourselves there had to be an explanation, a prank, a nearby event, a weird acoustic effect. We started digging into the history of the park and the gorge, not because we suddenly loved history, but because if we could label what we heard, maybe we could shrink it. We went to the library. We looked through local archives and old newspapers. It wasn't a dramatic town with a long list of tragedies, but there was one major event that kept appearing in the records. Years ago, a trolley bridge crossing the gorge had collapsed. People had fallen. People had died. The water had carried bodies. The current had dragged them down, then pushed them into the inlet along the shore. the shore that our curved path circled. The detail that made my skin go cold wasn't just the number of victims or the date. It was the description of the aftermath, the panic, the screaming, the crowd, the way people had gathered at the gorge, shouting and pointing and calling names into the dark water. Reading it, I found myself remembering the sound again, and the sound did not feel like a new thing anymore. It felt like a replay, a stamp pressed into the air that had never fully lifted. We also started looking into that house, the one you could see through the trees at a certain point on the path. During the day, we went to check it out, partly to prove to ourselves that we were brave, and partly because we wanted to see if squatters lived there, or if someone could have set up speakers or anything that would make sense. Up close, the house felt worse. It wasn't just run down. It had that wrongness you can't describe without sounding like you're inventing it. The yard had stacks of lumber piled in messy heaps, rotting in the weather like someone had begun a renovation and then walked away mid-swing. The windows looked dead. The air around it felt heavy in a way that made my mouth dry. We dug through records and found out why the house didn't fit. It hadn't always been there. It was originally built on the other side of town. There had been a serious fire at its original location. After the fire, for reasons that weren't explained clearly in the paperwork, the house was moved and placed near the park. A burned house transplanted beside a gorge with a history of bodies. I don't know if those facts connect in a neat line. I don't know if the house mattered at all, or if the whole area was simply a place where bad things had happened and left scars you couldn't see. But the logic didn't comfort me. It made it worse. It made it feel like the ground itself had memory. After that, I stayed away from the park at night. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it wasn't fear. I told myself it was just not worth it. But months passed, and fear dulls if you don't feed it. The sharp edges of that night softened. I started to talk about it like a story instead of a warning. I got a girlfriend, and like a lot of teenage boys, I wanted to impress her. I told her about the haunted park with that smug confidence people have when they're describing something they think they survived. We were walking one night, and without thinking about it, I led us toward that same path. The air was heavy in that familiar way, and the trees swallowed the street noise as soon as we got close. As we started up the hill, I saw the lone streetlight ahead of us, the one beacon before the woods. And I made a joke because that's what I did when I felt nervous. I pointed at it and said something stupid. I told her, "Don't worry, we'll be okay as long as that light doesn't burn out." The light flickered and died, not seconds later, not after a long, dramatic pause. Immediately, the darkness snapped down like a trap closing. My girlfriend didn't hesitate the way I had with my friend. She didn't try to rationalize it. She grabbed my arm and pulled me backward with sudden urgency, telling me we were leaving right now. Her voice had a thin edge to it, yet the kind you only get when someone's pretending not to panic. For a second, I couldn't move. I just stared at the dead bulb because the timing was so perfect it felt like a response, like something heard me. Then my eyes dropped to the ground and the fear came back in a new form. The shadows were wrong. Tree shadows don't move if the trees aren't moving. They might shift with wind or changing light. But the night was still. And yet the dark shapes on the path didn't sit where they should have. They seemed to slide, slow and smooth, circling around us like water moving around a drain. It wasn't fast, it wasn't flashy. It was subtle enough that I could have told myself it was my imagination, except the motion was too clean, too deliberate. It felt like the woods were rearranging themselves, like the darkness wasn't just absence of light, but a thing with its own behavior. I felt my throat tighten. I felt my heart kick hard. I didn't hear the roar of voices that time, but I didn't need it. That first night had already done its damage. Now the park didn't need to shout. It only needed to remind me. I let my girlfriend pull me away. We walked quickly back toward the main road, and I didn't look behind us. I didn't joke anymore. I didn't try to be brave. Every step felt like we were moving out of something that didn't want us there. When we reached the safety of real streetlights again, I finally breathed out, but the relief didn't feel clean. It felt like surrender. That was when I understood something that still makes me angry to admit. My skepticism had never been strength. It had been a shield made of denial. It worked fine until it met something that didn't care about my logic. I never went back into that park after dark. I drive past it sometimes and I glance toward that patch of trees, and my stomach still drops a little, the way it did as a teenager. Not because I'm looking for ghosts, because I know, as surely as I know my own name, that something happened there that night. Something that didn't need my belief to exist. And whatever lives in that section of woods, whatever memory, whatever echo, whatever presence, it felt real. It felt aware, and it felt like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. I was about 10 when it happened, and my little sister was 8. At that age, you don't have the words for what adults call it later. You don't know how to name patterns or diagnoses or the way alcohol can hollow a person out and fill them with something mean. You just know when a place doesn't feel right. You know when a house is too quiet, when your stomach tightens for no clear reason, when your skin feels prickly like it's warning you before your brain understands why. That night turned into one of those memories that doesn't fade the way other childhood memories do. It stays sharp. It comes back in flashes, the smell of damp concrete, the sound of a man making a noise he shouldn't be able to make, the thin edge of a light bulb buzzing, my sister's small voice saying something that should never have come out of an 8-year-old mouth. Drama practice ran late that day. I remember because I was annoyed about it. I wanted to be home. Or I wanted to dump my backpack, make a snack, and do anything that wasn't listening to adults tell us to project our voices or stand in a straighter line. Practice ended with the usual rush. Kids grabbing jackets, parents calling names, someone complaining that they couldn't find their script. I walked home with my backpack bouncing against my spine, the straps biting my shoulders. The air outside had that evening chill that makes your ears ache a little when you first step into it. Streetlights were on. The sky was already dark, the kind of black-blue that makes houses look flat and ordinary, like cutouts. From the sidewalk, our house looked the same as it always did. Lights on in some windows, shadow in others. A porch light that was a little too bright. A small front yard that always looked slightly tired no matter how much my mom tried to fix it up. Nothing about the outside warned me. If anything, it made me relax for half a second. Because home is supposed to be a place where you can let your guard down. The moment I opened the front door, the feeling changed. It wasn't a single sound or a single sight. It was the absence of things. The house didn't have its usual living noise. My little sister always watched cartoons before bed. Always. If she was awake, the TV was on. Even if she wasn't really watching, it hummed. It made the rooms feel occupied. It filled in the gaps. That night there was nothing. No TV, no music, no clatter of dishes, no distant conversation. Just quiet, thick and heavy, like the air had been pressed down. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The latch clicked loudly, too loud. I stood there for a second with my hand still on the knob, listening. Somewhere deeper in the house, I thought I heard something faint, not words. More like a rough sound, a voice broken up into pieces. It stopped as quickly as I noticed it, and then the house was still again. I called my sister's name softly, the way you do when you expect a quick answer and don't want to startle anyone. She didn't reply. I tried again, louder, nothing. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It felt like someone had turned down the world and left only the parts you weren't meant to hear. My backpack was still on my shoulder and I kept it there, like keeping it on would make it easier to turn around and leave if I needed to. I walked toward the stairs. Each step made a small creak. The sounds sounded wrong in the stillness, like they were being amplified. Upstairs, the hallway was dim. Light seeped from under one door, my sister's. I went to it and knocked lightly, then opened it without waiting because she was 8 and never locked her door. She was in bed, curled up tight like she was trying to make herself smaller. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open and shiny. She clutched her blanket up under her chin so hard her knuckles looked pale. Her whole body was tense, like she was braced for something to come through the door. For a second, I thought maybe she was sick. Maybe she'd had a nightmare. Maybe she'd heard something outside and scared herself. "Hey," I whispered, trying to keep my voice normal. "Why aren't you watching TV?" Normally, she would have popped up immediately. She would have started talking fast about whatever show was on, or she would have asked me if I brought home snacks, or she would have complained about homework she didn't want to do. That's what kids do when they're comfortable. She didn't move. She looked at me like she was afraid to speak too loudly. "Because Daddy is downstairs screaming," she said. The words hit me like cold water. Our stepdad, the man my mom married, the man who lived with us and was supposed to be the adult in the house. He had 2 versions. We had learned that early, even if we couldn't explain it. There was the daytime version who could be normal enough, who sometimes joked, who sometimes tried to act like a father, and then there was the nighttime version when he drank too much. When he drank, he became unpredictable, loud, either too friendly or too angry. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he shouted, sometimes he would slam cabinets and stomp around as if the house had personally offended him. He could be mean in a way that made you want to vanish. We didn't say drunk much because that word belonged to adults. My sister didn't understand what it meant. She called it acting silly because she was still trying to fit it into the kind of world an 8-year-old could manage. I swallowed and tried to keep my face calm. I didn't want to scare her more. "Is Daddy acting silly again?" I asked. She looked down at her blanket, then back up at me with eyes that were too old for her face. "Yeah," she whispered. "But he brought a friend over to play, and he didn't look so happy to play with him." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the sentence, it was the way she said it. Careful, trembling, like she was trying to say something terrible in a way that would make it less terrible. Like she didn't have the vocabulary for what was happening, so she used the closest word she knew. Play. An 8-year-old shouldn't say something like that. Now, a child shouldn't be listening to grown men downstairs and deciding whether one of them seems happy to play. I told her to stay in bed, to keep the door shut, and to be quiet. I didn't have a plan. I was 10. All I had was instinct and a growing sick certainty that we were alone in a situation that wasn't meant for kids. My mom wasn't home. I knew that. She worked late sometimes, or she'd go out to run errands and come back with that tired look on her face, trying to keep the household together like someone trying to carry water in a cracked cup. She wouldn't be back for hours. That meant whatever was happening downstairs, we were trapped with it. I stepped back into the hallway and closed my sister's door most of the way, leaving it just barely cracked so I could hear her if she called me. I walked toward the stairs slowly. Each step closer made my skin feel tighter, like my body was trying to prepare itself. At the top of the stairs, I stopped and listened again. The basement door was downstairs, off the main hallway near the kitchen. I could picture it exactly, a plain door with an old knob, usually shut. The cellar stairs were steep, the kind you don't run on because you might break your neck. From where I stood, I could hear something now, not clearly, just a low, wet sound that rose and fell like someone struggling to breathe. It didn't sound like laughter. It didn't sound like normal yelling. It sounded wrong. It made the hair on my arms lift. Then I heard my stepdad's voice, slurred, thick, words running together. He was talking, but not in a way that made sense. It was the sound of a person not fully present anymore. He was the kind of drunk that turned language into noise. I moved down the stairs, each step slow. I didn't call his name. I didn't announce myself. Some part of me knew that attention was dangerous. The closer I got to the basement door, the stronger the smell was. Not just basement smell, though there was that too, the dampness, the faint mildew, the cold. There was another smell layered over it, sharp and chemical, like something hot or metallic. It didn't fully register until later when I understood what I'd actually walked toward. The cellar door was closed. I put my hand on the knob. It felt colder than it should have. I turned it slowly and opened it, just enough to look. The stairwell was dark, lit only by a single bulb down below that cast a weak yellow circle. Shadows climbed the walls. The air that drifted up felt damp and stale, like the basement was exhaling. And the sound was clearer now, that gurgling, choking sound. It wasn't a person talking. It was a person trying to breathe while hurt. My knees went slightly weak. I sat on the top step, partly because my legs didn't trust themselves, partly because I needed to be quiet. I held my breath and listened. My stepdad was down there. I could hear him moving, the scrape of shoes, the clink of something against something else. His voice rose and fell in messy bursts. Sometimes it sounded like he was trying to be friendly. Sometimes it sounded like he was angry. It swayed back and forth like he couldn't choose a mood. I should have backed away right then. I should have gone upstairs, grabbed my sister, and run straight out of the house without looking at anything else. But I was 10, and 10-year-olds make mistakes because they think they need to know what's going on before they can act. I took one step down, then another. Slowly, quietly, my hand sliding along the wall to steady myself. The air got colder as I descended. The smell got stronger. That sharp metallic scent mixed with damp concrete and something else, something like sweat and spilled liquor. I reached a point on the stairs where I could lean just slightly and see around the corner into the basement. Yet what I saw didn't feel real at first. My brain tried to turn it into something safer, a mess, a spill, a fight that would end quickly. But it wasn't something safe. On the basement floor was a man, a family friend. I didn't know him well, but I recognized him the way kids recognize adults who come around often enough. He had been in our kitchen before, laughing with my stepdad. He had sat on our couch. He had patted my head once and called me buddy in that casual way grown men do. Now he was on the concrete, twisted awkwardly, shirt torn, skin smeared with dark stains. His face was swollen in places. He looked terrified in a way that made him seem younger and older at the same time. He wasn't fully unconscious, but he wasn't moving much either. His hands moved weakly, like he wanted to push himself away, but couldn't. My stepdad stood over him, swaying. In one hand, he had a bottle. In the other, he held something that took my mind a second to identify, because it didn't belong in that scene. A welding tool. I knew what it was because my stepdad had one for projects. He would brag about it sometimes. He kept it in the basement because he didn't want it in the garage, and he didn't want anyone touching it. It was one of those adult objects that seemed powerful and dangerous, the kind you weren't supposed to go near. I saw him fumble with it, like his hands didn't work right. I heard a click, then a hiss. A small, bright glow appeared at the tip, the kind of glow that doesn't look like normal light. It looks like heat made visible. My throat closed. My body felt numb. My stepdad stumbled closer to the man on the floor. He took a drink from the bottle without taking his eyes off him, like he was keeping himself steady with it. He leaned down. I won't describe everything in detail because even remembering it makes me feel sick. But I will never forget the sound that came out of that man. It was a scream, but it wasn't clean. It was raw and broken, the kind of sound that comes out when something is happening that your body cannot handle. It echoed off the basement walls and came up the stairwell like a wave. My stepdad laughed once, short and ugly, then said something I couldn't understand. His words slurred together, but the tone was clear. He was in control of the situation, and he liked that. The man on the floor lifted his head, and that's when he saw me. Our eyes met for a second. His face was full of terror, not just for himself, but for me. For a child standing on basement steps, watching a nightmare unfold. In one harsh breath, he forced out a single word. "Run!" That word snapped something in the air. It changed the shape of the moment. It made my stepdad freeze. The welding tool slipped from his hand and dropped, still hissing. It landed wrong. And the man on the floor flinched hard, making that awful sound again. My stepdad didn't seem to notice. His attention had turned. He looked toward the stairs, toward me. His face was red and blotchy. His eyes were unfocused, but they locked onto me anyway. For a second, he didn't react. It was like he had to process what he was seeing, like his drunk mind had to decide whether I was real or part of whatever angry story he was living inside. Then he started walking toward the stairs. He's slow at first, deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl, not stumbling away, not turning back to the man, coming for me. My mind screamed at my body to move, but fear made my legs heavy. I tried to back up, and my foot slipped. My heel slid on the edge of a step, and I went down hard, landing on my side. Pain shot through my hip and elbow. The shock of it made me gasp, but I couldn't waste time on pain. He kept coming. His voice rose as he climbed, echoing in the narrow stairwell. "You want to be like me, son?" he shouted. His words were jagged, half a question, half an accusation. He sounded like he was talking to someone else. He sounded like he was arguing with a ghost in his own head and using me as a stand-in. "I'm your daddy," he said, and the word daddy made my stomach flip because it didn't fit. He wasn't my dad. He was my stepdad. He didn't get to say that like it meant something. "I'll protect you." Protect you, as he advanced up the stairs. As his friend screamed behind him on the basement floor, his mood shifted in the space of a breath. His voice dipped suddenly, almost gentle, like he was talking to a toddler. "No, no, don't cry," he said softly. Then he snapped, his face twisting, and he screamed so loud it felt like the sound shook the steps beneath me. "Don't you fucking cry, you little shit!" The contradiction was the most frightening part. Not just that he was angry, but that he could switch like that. From soft to violent, as if two different people were fighting over his mouth. That was the moment survival took over. Pain didn't matter, shock didn't matter. I scrambled backward on hands and feet, slipping, catching myself, then turning and running up the stairs as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him behind me, heavy footsteps thudding, his breath loud, his voice spilling into curses and nonsense. I burst through the cellar door and slammed it behind me. The sound of it hitting the frame felt weak compared to what was inside. I didn't lock it. There wasn't time. I ran down the hallway, my socks sliding on the floor. I flew up the stairs, taking them two at a time. My sister's door was closed. I threw it open and she was still in bed, eyes wide, tears running down her cheeks. She had heard the scream. She had heard the shouting. She was frozen in the same kind of fear I had been frozen in on the stairs. "Get up," I gasped. "Now." She started shaking her head, not understanding, not wanting to. I didn't have time to explain. I ran to the window. My mom had installed an escape ladder in my sister's room. That was not normal. Other kids didn't have ladders hanging by their windows. At the time, I didn't fully understand why we had it, only that my mom insisted it was for safety. Now I understood. I yanked the ladder down and hooked it over the sill the way I had been taught. My hands were shaking so badly it took 2 tries. Outside the window, the night air rushed in, cold and sharp. From downstairs, I heard a crash, a door hitting a wall, footsteps. He was coming. "Go," I told my sister, and my voice came out like a shout. She climbed onto the ladder crying, her hands slipping on the rungs. I leaned out and held the sides steady as best I could. She moved slowly because she was 8 and terrified. Each second felt like too much. I could hear my stepdad's voice downstairs again, still shouting, still swinging between sentences that didn't make sense. I could hear him moving like he was searching the house, like he didn't remember where he had just seen me. My sister reached the ground and stumbled backward in the yard. I climbed out next, dropping the last few feet because my legs wouldn't trust the ladder anymore. We ran. We ran around the side of the house, through the dark yard, down the street. Our breath burned in our lungs. My sister's cries turned into gasping sobs. I held her wrist because I was afraid she would trip and I would lose her in the dark. We didn't stop until we reached help. We ran until the streetlights looked brighter and the houses looked closer together and the world felt less like a trap. We went to the police. Even saying that now feels strange, because it sounds like something that should have happened in an adult story, not a kid's. But we did. We found someone who listened, someone who believed the fear in our faces, if nothing else. I remember sitting in a bright room that smelled like old coffee, my sister pressed against my side, while an officer asked questions in a calm voice. I remember trying to explain what I saw and having the words come out wrong, because 10-year-olds don't know how to describe cruelty without sounding like they're making it up. That night changed everything. Adults got involved fast after that. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. Lights flashed outside our house. There were voices, serious voices, the kind that don't let you pretend something is normal. I don't know exactly what happened to the man in the basement afterward, because kids don't get told everything. But I know enough to know it was real. I know it wasn't a misunderstanding. I know it wasn't acting silly. And even now, years later, I still carry the feeling of that moment on the stairs. The instant I realized the danger in our house wasn't something outside. It wasn't a stranger. It was a person we lived with. A person the adults had tried to make normal by calling it drinking and shrugging and hoping for better nights. When I think about it, I can still hear the welder's hiss. I can still see that man's eyes when he looked up at me and told me to run. I can still hear my stepdad's voice echoing up those stairs, confused and furious, a switching from soft to violent like he couldn't control which version of himself was speaking. And the part I can't get rid of, no matter how much time passes, is this. We had an escape ladder installed in an 8-year-old's bedroom. My mom put it there because she knew, somewhere inside her, she knew there would be a night when the safest thing her children could do was climb out a window and run. It began sometime between 1982 and 1985. Back when my memories still come in short flashes and feelings more than clear scenes. I was very small, somewhere between 3 and 5, and my sister was about a year younger than me. We were the kind of young family people look at and assume everything is simple. Dad worked hard, Mom stayed home, and 2 little kids followed her around the house like ducklings. My father was a journalist who chased stories and deadlines and wasn't home much. My mother was a midwife who had stepped away from her job for a while so she could be with us. They wanted a fresh start, a better place to raise kids, and they found a house in Brisbane that looked, from the street, like an ordinary single-story home. But the land sloped down sharply at the back, and that made the inside of the house feel like it had been built in halves that didn't fully agree with each other. From the front, you stepped into the living room and the hallway that led to my bedroom. Then there was a carpeted landing that connected the front section to the back section. That landing mattered because it was the place where Mom always said, Her body reacted first, before her mind could explain why. From that landing, you had stairs going up to the master bedroom on the left, my sister's nursery straight ahead, and a bathroom on the right. Under those stairs, the house opened out into a lower level that didn't feel like part of the home you saw from the street. At the bottom of the stairs, there was a side door that led out to an entertainment area, with a barbecue and a bit of cover, and then you could step into the backyard. If you ignored that side door and turned right, you walked under an archway into a large concrete room underneath the house. We called it the rumpus room because it was meant to be a play area. But it wasn't warm timber and sunlight like a normal family space. It was concrete. It was shaped like an L, and it carried sound in a strange way like a tunnel. Tucked under the stairs inside that room was a small tiled laundry that felt darker than it should have been even in daylight. And at the far end of the rumpus room there was another door that led straight out to the backyard. It sounds like too much detail, but the layout is part of why the fear in that house was so hard to shake. It wasn't just one creepy hallway or one spare room you could avoid. The house had places where light didn't reach properly. It had corners where a child could stand and not be seen from the main rooms. It had a lower level that felt separate from the rest of the home, like you could cross a line without realizing it. And because Dad worked long hours and was often out late, Mom spent many nights there alone with a toddler and a baby, listening to a building settle around her and trying to tell herself it was normal. She told me later that the first signs came quickly within a month or two. Not a dramatic moment, not a flying object or a screaming voice, just small warnings that, at the time, she tried to explain away because she had to. The first one was our dog, Mandy. Mandy was old, loyal, the kind of dog that had always followed the family from room to room. In that Brisbane house, she refused to come inside. Not once. She stayed in her kennel out the back as if it was the only safe place on the property. Mum would go out to hang washing or sweep leaves, and Mandy would follow her around the yard, tail wagging, relaxed. But the moment Mum turned and walked toward the back door, Mandy would stop dead. Her tail would drop between her legs. She would start to whimper, a small sound that didn't fit an old dog who had seen storms and fireworks and all kinds of family noise. Mandy would plant her paws and refuse to cross the threshold, no matter how gently Mum called her. It wasn't stubbornness, it was fear. At the time, Mum told herself it was just a dog being strange in a new place. She didn't want to believe it meant anything. Then the laundry started flooding. Not a burst pipe, not water pouring from a hose. Just water. Mum would go down into that tiled laundry under the stairs and find the floor covered in a sheet of it. While the rooms next to it stayed dry. They checked taps and pipes. They looked for leaks. Dad, practical and skeptical, would poke around and find nothing obvious and say it must be an old house. Must be humidity, must be a blocked drain. They'd mop it up and move on because that's what you do when you're trying to make a home work. But it kept happening, and it didn't make sense. Then there were the light bulbs. Mum and Dad would walk into the back section at night and find a bulb shattered. Not just dead, glass blown out, pieces scattered as if the bulb had burst with force. It wasn't a gentle flicker and pop. It looked violent. It looked angry. Mum began to hate walking from the front of the house to the back at night. She told me that the moment she stepped onto that carpeted landing, she would feel it. Her skin would tighten. The hair on her arms and the back of her neck would stand up. It was a heavy, sinking feeling, like someone else was standing nearby in the dark, watching her move. She couldn't see anything, but her body acted as if it could. Checking on my baby sister in the nursery should have been a peaceful thing. A mother standing in a doorway, listening to tiny breaths, smoothing a blanket. In that house, Mum said it became a task she had to prepare herself for every night. She would pause on the landing, swallow, and force herself to keep going. She never told Dad how bad it felt at first because he was tired, because he didn't like nonsense, because she didn't want to be the one making problems when he already worked so much. But the fear didn't lessen. It grew. Then sounds started. They would lie in bed upstairs and hear shuffling feet down in the rumpus room below them, a slow, dragging movement across concrete that made both of them go still. They would listen. They would wait for it to stop. Sometimes Dad would sit up and call out, annoyed, thinking a window had been left open and something had blown in, or that Mandy had gotten inside somehow. But Mandy never came inside, and when Dad would go down to check, the room would be empty and the air would feel cooler than it should. And he would come back upstairs acting irritated, not frightened, as if being wrong was more uncomfortable to him than the possibility of anything strange. Other times, Mum would be alone in the front of the house while Dad was working. She'd be knitting or watching TV with one of us asleep nearby. She would hear clear, loud laughter coming from the back of the house. Not a child's giggle in the next room. Not a radio. It was laughter that made her blood run cold because she knew, without question, she was alone. She would get up, heart hammering, and walk toward the back because she had to, because she couldn't just sit there and pretend. She would find me asleep. She would find my sister asleep. She would find the back section empty and silent. But the feeling of a presence would remain, like the house was holding its breath. Mum tried to keep life normal. You can't live on high alert all day, every day, especially with small children. You have meals to cook, nappies to change, baths to run. She would push fear down and focus on routine, but the house kept pressing back like it didn't want her to forget. The night that made everything change, the night she stopped wondering if she was imagining it, happened when my aunt stayed over with her 18-month-old baby. Dad and my uncle were away painting my grandmother's lounge room after work, so it was just the women at our house, the kids, and the strange, heavy quiet that settled in when the sun went down. My aunt was complaining about teething. The baby had been crying at night because his gums hurt. They had run out of teething gel, and Mum, trying to be helpful, offered to drive to the pharmacy and grab Bonjela. Before she left, she did something she hadn't done with many people. She warned her sister. She told my aunt she thought something was wrong with the house. She said Dad didn't believe her. She said strange things happened, and if my aunt heard something while she was gone, she shouldn't panic. She should just be aware. Mum expected to be laughed at, and she was. My aunt considered herself strong and spiritual. She said she'd been in haunted places before and would have sensed it. She told Mum she was talking rubbish and that she was letting stress get the better of her. Mum left anyway, promising she'd be back in 20 or 30 minutes. When she pulled up on her return, she saw my uncle's car out the front. That was wrong. He wasn't meant to be there yet. Mum said her stomach dropped before she even got out of the car. She walked inside and found chaos. My aunt was sobbing uncontrollably. Not a quiet, tearful sniff. Full-body sobs, shaking, the kind you can't hide. My uncle was trying to calm her down. Dad, the skeptic, was there too, poking fun at her the way people do when they're uncomfortable, asking if she'd gotten spooked. Mum didn't smile. She didn't join in. She asked one question straight away. Had they heard something? My aunt, through tears, said yes. She said the house came alive after Mum left. She could feel heavy thumps coming up through the floorboards, like something moving below. Then she heard a voice calling her name. Not Mum's voice, not Dad's. A voice clear enough that she turned expecting to see someone. After that, she heard laughter from the back of the house, and the way she described it made Mum's skin crawl because it matched what Mum had been hearing when she was alone. My aunt said the house felt evil. She didn't use that word lightly. She wasn't joking now. Mum was terrified, but for the first time she wasn't alone in it. Someone else had experienced it. someone who had mocked her only half an hour before. Dad still tried to brush it off. He was tired and proud and didn't want to admit his wife might be right about something he couldn't explain. But Mom couldn't unhear her sister's fear. She couldn't undo the relief and horror of having a witness. It made the situation real in a way it hadn't been when she was the only one saying it. After that, she started asking questions. Not dramatic interrogations, just casual conversations with neighbors, the way you do when you're trying not to look like you're searching for something frightening. She found one neighbor who was willing to talk. That neighbor told her about the previous renter. A woman had lived there who had gone a bit crazy after a messy divorce. That's how the neighbor put it, in the blunt language people use when they don't know the full story, but they know it ended badly. The woman's life had fallen apart. She got involved in a strange religion. People came to the house every few weeks, the neighbor said, and held gatherings inside to contact spirits. The neighbor pointed toward the rumpus room under the house. That was where it happened. They had seen candles burning in the windows of that bottom room late at night. Mom was a churchgoer at that stage. She wasn't the kind of person who took the idea of spirits lightly. Hearing that, she said, felt like a cold hand on her spine. It didn't prove anything scientifically, but it clicked into the part of her mind that had been trying to explain the impossible flooding, the shattered bulbs, the laughter, the footsteps. It gave her fear a shape. From that moment on, she wanted out. She didn't want us living there another week, another day. But Dad, still stuck in disbelief, refused to move. He said it was nonsense. He said neighbors make up stories. He said the house was fine. They argued. Quietly at first because we were small. Then not so quietly as stress piled up. Looking back, Mum believed that house helped crack their marriage open faster because it isolated her and made her feel unsupported in her own fear. While the adults fought, Mum noticed something else that bothered her. All our toys and tricycles were kept in the rumpus room. It was meant to be our play space, but I would never go down there, not ever. Even as a toddler, I avoided it the way animals avoid deep water. Mum had first thought I just wanted to stay near her. Then she realized it was more than that. I was afraid of that space. When my older cousin, who was about a year older than me, visited, she refused to go down there too. She didn't say it in a dramatic way. She just stopped at the archway and said she didn't want to. When asked why, she said the things down there scared her. Kids don't always have the words, but they have instincts. Mum started to believe that the house didn't just feel wrong to her because she was stressed. It felt wrong to children, too. Over the next months, the activity seemed to move closer, like it had grown tired of being ignored. Apparently, I began talking about a man who sat on top of my wardrobe and watched me at night. I don't remember saying it, but Mum remembered it clearly because it made her feel sick. It's one thing to hear an odd sound in another room. It's another to have a small child point at furniture and say someone sits there looking down. Mum tried to react calmly in front of me, but later she told me she felt her chest go tight with fear. She got rid of the wardrobe, hoping that if the object was gone, the place for the man would be gone too. For a little while she thought it helped. Then something happened that convinced her it didn't matter what furniture she moved. Whatever was in the house could do what it wanted. She was getting changed in her bedroom upstairs. By then she was heavily pregnant with my baby brother, around 7 months. I was downstairs in the front of the house, watching Sesame Street, absorbed in the TV the way only a small child can be. Mom went to leave her room and found the door wouldn't open. At first, she assumed the latch was stuck, the way old doors sometimes jam. She rattled the handle. She pulled. She pushed. It didn't budge. It was locked from the outside. She called out to me, asking me to come help. I didn't hear her. The TV was on. I was too young to notice anything beyond the screen. She grew more frightened as the minutes passed because she understood with a mother's blunt sense of danger, that being trapped upstairs while pregnant and alone was not something to shrug off. In the end, she did something that still makes my stomach twist when I picture it. She opened the window and climbed out. A pregnant woman, climbing out onto the drain pipe and shimmying down, awkward and terrified, onto the entertainment area below. She didn't do it because she was brave. She did it because she had no choice. She rushed back inside through the side door and ran up the stairs, breathing hard, heart racing, anger mixing with fear. When she reached her bedroom door from the outside, it was wide open, unlocked, as if it had never been stuck at all. She came downstairs and scolded me, telling me never to lock Mummy in her room again. I looked at her with pure confusion and said I hadn't moved. I'd been watching Sesame Street the whole time. Mum looked at my face and knew I was telling the truth. I was too small for one thing, and even if I had been able to reach the lock, I hadn't left the front room. The timing didn't match. The house had trapped her, then released her, and there was no one to blame. That was when she stopped trying to rationalize and started looking for help. She went to a local pastor. He listened and gave her two options, both of them sounding awful in different ways. One was to ignore it and hope it went away. The other was to play loud hymns and read Bible verses, to confront whatever was there and try to drive it out. But he warned her it could backfire. He said if it was something dark, it might react violently, and things could start being thrown. Mum was stuck between doing nothing and risking making it worse. Around that time, my great-grandmother visited. She was deeply religious, the kind of woman who walked through the world with quiet certainty. One day she went down into the rumpus room to fetch a toy for me. When she came back up, she was pale. She looked at Mum and said there were evil faces looking at her down there, leering at her. Mum didn't know what to do with that information, but she believed my great-grandmother wasn't the type to invent horror for attention. Later, another pastor confirmed what Mum feared. He told her that whether she believed in it or not, there were 2 or 3 demonic entities connected to the back of the house. Mum didn't want the word demonic. She didn't want any of it. She wanted normal. But normal had left that house a long time ago. By then, my parents' marriage was breaking down. Dad was gone more often. Divorce was in the air, even if the word wasn't always said in front of us. Mum began packing anyway. She started looking for another house and making plans to move. She did it quietly, determined, like a person preparing for escape. She was only days away from moving us out when the house took its final shot. It happened in my sister's room, the nursery upstairs. Mum went to check on my sister, who was about 2 by then. It was just a normal check, the kind of thing she did every night. She walked down that hallway with the familiar dread she had learned to swallow, then stepped into the nursery and looked into the cot. The cot was empty. Mom said her heart stopped so completely she couldn't breathe for a second. Her mind went blank. Then her eyes snapped to the window above the cot. It was wide open. This wasn't a modern, easy window. It was old-fashioned, heavy, a horizontal sliding window with a vertical latch halfway up the side. Mom said it was difficult for an adult to open smoothly, especially if the latch was stiff. A 2-year-old couldn't have worked it. The fly screen that should have been behind it had been damaged. The rubber seal was ripped out, and a flap of screen was swinging in the breeze like someone had torn it aside in a hurry. Mom ran to the window and looked down. Below it was a fiberglass annex that covered the back door area. It now had a huge dent in it, and the supports were cracked or broken, as if something had hit it hard from above. She looked farther down into the backyard and saw my sister crawling in the grass. Mandy, the dog who refused to enter the house, was beside her, playing as if nothing had happened. Mum didn't think. She screamed and ran. Down the stairs, out through the back, across the yard, scooping my sister up with shaking hands, checking her head, her arms, her legs, searching for blood that somehow wasn't there. My sister cried, confused more than hurt, but like she couldn't understand why Mum was suddenly so frightened. A doctor came. My sister was checked over. Miraculously, she was mostly fine, though she had a concussion. The doctor said it was incredible she hadn't broken her neck. The kind of fall she'd taken could have killed her. When Mum, Dad, and the doctor tried to ask my sister what happened, she pointed up and said, "Doggy down, down, down." It was a small child's sentence, but it made Mum's blood run cold. The picture formed in her mind, whether she wanted it or not. My sister falling, hitting the annex, landing in the yard, seeing the dog. But the problem was the same as everything else in that house. The logistics didn't add up. My sister could not have climbed out of the cot, reached the latch, slid the heavy window open, torn the screen, and climbed out, all without waking Mum or making a noise. It didn't make sense. It felt like something had helped her, lured her, pulled her, thrown her. That day, Mum didn't wait for night. She didn't argue with Dad anymore. She grabbed us and got out. She packed what she could and left that house behind. They didn't stay another night. They didn't see how it goes. They didn't try one more prayer or one more repair. They fled. And even now, decades later, when my family talks about that time, the fear still sounds fresh in their voices. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was months of small, impossible things. The building pressure like a storm that never breaks, until the house stopped being just a house and became a threat. Dad may have doubted at first, but even he couldn't call what happened to my sister just stress. Even he couldn't explain a heavy window open and a child out in the yard with a concussion. That's what haunts me most when I think back on it. Not the word demonic, not the neighbor's story about rituals, not even the laughter in the back rooms. It's the way the house seemed to learn, the way it started with the dog refusing to cross a threshold, then moved to water where water shouldn't be, then light bulbs exploding, then footsteps and voices, then finally turning its attention to the people inside, to my mother's body, to my sister's cot. Like something had been invited in before we arrived. And once we moved in, it decided to see how far it could go before we broke. In the end, it didn't need to prove anything. It just needed to get close enough that my mother would never doubt herself again. And it did. It was the summer of 2024, and for a while, it really did feel like the start of real life. Ocean City, Maryland was exactly what you picture when someone says summer job at the beach. The boardwalk always smelled like sugar and salt and hot fryer oil. You could hear seagulls even when you couldn't see the water. Everyone walked around sunburned and happy, carrying beach chairs and cheap souvenirs. At night, the whole place glowed. Neon signs, arcade lights, the flashing ride displays. And it was hard not to believe you were living inside a movie where nothing serious could happen. Steve and I had that typical college summer feeling where you're tired all the time but somehow still excited. We were in between our freshman and sophomore years, old enough to feel independent, young enough to still act like every day was a rehearsal for adulthood instead of the real thing. We worked at a laser tag center, which was loud and chaotic in its own harmless way. Inside, it was always dark and pulsing with music and colored lights. You'd walk out after a shift and the daylight would feel too bright, like you'd been underwater for hours and suddenly surfaced. We were on the schedule for later that day, but we showed up early like we often did. It wasn't even about being responsible. It was just fun to be there before the crowds came in, when the machines were still quiet and the air still felt cool from the overnight AC. We'd play a couple arcade games, mess around, and stretch the last minutes of being off the clock as long as possible. We played a few rounds of a ticket game and won just enough to buy something dumb. The prize counter had all the usual stuff. Plastic rings, tiny stuffed animals, those sticky hands that leave marks on walls. We weren't trying to save up for a big prize. We were just killing time. We cashed our tickets in for those small rubber bouncy balls, the kind you can toss against a wall and catch without thinking. It felt like something a kid would do, and that was the point. We were still kids, really, just taller, louder kids with a job badge. After that, we went behind the building to smoke before our shift. Employees used that back area as a break spot because you could actually hear yourself think. It wasn't pretty, it was a concrete patch by the parking lot, with a fence and some bushes that did almost nothing to hide it. But it was ours. Out there, the air was thick and humid in that Maryland way. The kind that makes your shirt stick to you even if you're standing still. Right behind the laser tag place, separated by a wooden fence and some overgrown bushes, there was a 4-story apartment building filled with vacationers. Ocean City is full of those places. Families come in for a week, cram into a condo, and spend their days on the beach and their nights grilling and letting kids run wild because it's vacation. The building had that open-air design you see at beach towns. Outdoor walkways instead of interior hallways, stairs on the outside, railings along the edges. It was kind of like a motel setup, only stacked higher. The walkways were exposed to the sun, the wind, the noise. People could stand on their balcony and shout down to someone in the parking lot like it was no big deal. Yes, Steve and I leaned against the back wall, flicking our bouncy ball back and forth with one hand, cigarettes in the other, talking about the usual stuff. The upcoming semester, money, how we were already sick of real life, even though we hadn't done anything yet. Steve was one of those people who could make even boring conversation feel entertaining. He talked fast, laughed easily, and never stayed on a dark thought for long. I was different. I've always noticed things I didn't want to notice. I've always had that annoying habit of imagining the worst and then trying to argue myself out of it. That day, while Steve was talking, my eyes wandered up to the apartment building. There were kids on the walkways running along the railings like it was a playground. It looked normal at first. They were playing some kind of tag, laughing, chasing each other. Their voices carried across the open air in a way that made it hard not to hear them even behind a fence. Oh, then I noticed one kid on the top floor who wasn't really part of the game. He was leaning forward over the railing in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not just a casual lean. He was leaning far out, like he was trying to see straight down. He was either spitting or dropping something, maybe pebbles or bits of dirt. He kept shifting his weight, leaning farther, pulling back, leaning again. From where I stood, I couldn't see his face clearly, so I could only see the casual carelessness of a kid who doesn't fully understand gravity. And something happened in my head that didn't feel like normal worry. It wasn't a thought I built step by step. It just arrived, sharp and cold, like a sentence someone spoke directly into my brain. He's going to fall. I hate saying that now because it sounds dramatic, like I'm trying to turn a tragedy into a supernatural story. But that's genuinely how it felt in the moment. Not, he might fall. Not, that looks dangerous. It felt like certainty, like my body reacted before my mind could soften it into a possibility. I nudged Steve and pointed up. I told him the kid was making me nervous and that I thought he was going to fall. Steve barely looked. He laughed the way people laugh when you're ruining the vibe. He threw the rubber ball at my arm, not hard, just enough to snap me out of it. He said I was being paranoid. He said talk like that freaked him out and I needed to shut up. He tried to make it into a joke, like it was an annoying superstition I was bringing into our smoke break. I tried to let it go. I really did. I sat down on one of those concrete parking blocks, forcing myself to look at Steve instead of staring upward. I nodded at his story. I even smiled when he smiled. but my eyes kept flicking back to the top floor like my body didn't trust my brain's decision to relax. There's a particular kind of fear that's hard to describe. It isn't panic, it isn't dread like a horror movie. It's the feeling of watching something teeter on the edge of happening, like a glass tipping off a counter in slow motion. You can see it, you can feel it, but you're too far away to stop it. That's what it felt like something was already in motion and I was just waiting for gravity to do what gravity does. Steve said something and I turned my head to answer him. It was only a few seconds, just long enough for me to try being normal again. Then we heard it. It started with a scream that didn't belong to a game. Kids scream all the time in summer. Playful screams, fake screams, dramatic screams. This wasn't that. It was short and sharp, like the sound got ripped out of someone. It had terror in it, raw and sudden. And right after that came the sound that split my life into before and after. A wet, heavy thud. People who haven't heard it think a body hitting pavement sounds like something you'd hear in a movie. A loud smack, maybe, something clean. This wasn't clean, it wasn't dramatic, it was just awful. It sounded like something that should never be dropped, being dropped from very high. It was the kind of sound your brain refuses to accept, because accepting it means you have to understand what happened. For half a second after the impact, everything felt silent. Not literally silent, the world still had its usual noise, but it felt like my ears stopped trusting sound, like the air thickened, like the normal summer day had been interrupted by something that didn't belong there. I didn't decide to move. My body moved on its own. I jumped up from the parking block and sprinted toward the fence. I don't even remember thinking about the height or the bushes. I vaulted the fence, shoved through the scratchy branches, and burst into the apartment parking lot. The kid was lying face down on the pavement. It was immediately clear he had fallen from the top floor. There was no way to misunderstand it. There was blood spreading beneath his head, darkening the asphalt, creeping outward too quickly like the ground itself was drinking it. For a split second, my mind tried to protect me by making it unreal. Like maybe it was a dummy, like maybe it was a prank, like maybe I'd run into the wrong scene. Then his body moved, just slightly, and that snapped reality into place. I heard Steve behind me crashing through the bushes. He was moving slower than I had, not because he didn't care, but because he was still trying to process what he'd heard. I spun and screamed at him to call 911. I was yelling words that didn't even form a plan. Call, now, hurry, get help, do something. I yelled up at the walkways too, at the other kids who were frozen in shock. Their small faces turned down toward the pavement, like they couldn't understand that the game had ended and something real had happened. My legs carried me closer to the boy, even though every part of me wanted to stop. There's a reflex you have in emergencies where you think you can fix it if you just get there fast enough. Like speed can reverse physics. Like arriving quickly can undo a fall. When I got close enough to really see him, I felt something in me go hollow. Yeah, I won't describe every detail because even now it makes my stomach turn, but the injury was catastrophic. The sight was so wrong that my brain wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't. I remember thinking, in a moment so dark it still scares me, that I almost wished he was already dead. Not because I wanted him gone, but because the suffering seemed too big for a child's body to hold. He was alive. He started screaming. At first it sounded like pain, but then it shifted into something else. Something raw, panic, confusion, terror. He wasn't screaming like a kid who scraped his knee. He was screaming like a human being who suddenly understood, in a flash, that he was leaving the world and didn't want to. He kept calling out for Jesus. I wasn't religious. I'm not. I didn't have the kind of faith that gives you something comforting to say in moments like that. Hearing him cry out shook me in a way I can't explain. It wasn't about theology. It was the sound of a child reaching for the one thing he'd been taught might catch him when everything else failed. I knelt beside him, but I didn't touch him at first because I didn't know what touching would do. I didn't want to cause more damage. I didn't want to make it worse. I also didn't want him to be alone. My hands hovered uselessly in the air. I remember feeling the heat of the pavement through my jeans, the smell of hot asphalt and salt air mixed with something metallic. Steve's voice sounded far away. People began to gather, the air filled with shouting. Someone was crying. I kept looking around for an adult, for someone who would know what to do, because in my head, I was still just a kid with a summer job. I didn't feel qualified to be on the ground next to a dying child making choices. The boy's screams were frantic, rising and falling like he couldn't catch his breath. His skin looked like it was losing color in front of my eyes. And I remember being hit by helplessness so hard it felt like nausea. I wanted to lie to him and say it would be okay. I wanted to tell him help was coming. I wanted to make the world softer for him. But I also knew, in a way I couldn't escape, that some things don't get better. They only end. Then an adult came running out of a ground floor apartment. His aunt. She was screaming before she even reached him. Her scream was different from the child's. It had grief in it, the kind that doesn't wait for confirmation. It was an instinctive howl, as if her body already knew what her mind was about to see. She rushed toward him with her hands out like she was going to pick him up. Everything in me reacted at once. I had taken basic first aid courses, and the one thing that was drilled into us was that you do not move someone who has fallen from a height. You don't know what's broken. You don't know what's holding together by accident. Moving them can kill them. So I stood up and stepped in front of her. I had to. It felt horrible, like I was blocking a mother from her child, like I was committing some kind of cruelty. She didn't understand why I was stopping her. She only saw a stranger between her and her nephew. She fought me with a strength that came from pure terror. She scratched at me, kicked at me, screamed at me to get out of the way. Her eyes were wild. She wasn't thinking in logic. She was thinking in blood and love and desperation. Now, I kept yelling that she couldn't move him, that she had to wait for the ambulance, that moving him could make it worse. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. I could feel my arms shaking from the effort of holding her back without hurting her. More adults arrived then, drawn by the sound and the commotion. They saw what was happening and helped me. They grabbed her and pulled her back, holding her as she collapsed into sobs that barely sounded human. The scene became a storm of its own. People crowded in. Someone told the kids upstairs to go inside. Someone shouted that an ambulance was coming. Someone else yelled that the police had been called. In the middle of that chaos, I realized I hadn't heard sirens yet. My brain latched onto the need to do something concrete, something simple. I pulled my phone out, intending to call Steve or call 911 myself if he hadn't. My hands were trembling so hard my screen blurred. That's when the aunt's eyes snapped to my phone. She saw me holding it up, and in her grief and confusion, she made the worst possible assumption. She thought I was filming. She thought I was taking a picture of her nephew dying on the ground. She screamed at me with a hatred so sharp it felt physical. She called me a sick person. She spat words at me like they were knives. I tried to speak, but nothing came out fast enough. How do you explain in that moment? How do you defend yourself without sounding like you're making excuses? Her world was ending, and my intentions didn't matter to her. All she could see was a young stranger standing near her dying nephew with a phone in his hand. Even though I knew she was wrong, it hurt in a way I still feel. That accusation didn't just sting because it was unfair. It stung because it reminded me how powerless I was. I couldn't save him. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't even control how people saw me while I tried. By the time the ambulance arrived, the boy had grown quieter. The frantic screaming faded into ragged breathing and then into a silence that made everyone around him move differently. The paramedics rushed in with the kind of focused efficiency that looks cold until you realize it's the only way to function in tragedy. They assessed him quickly, stabilized him, and worked fast, their movements practiced and urgent. I stood back, my hands smeared with nothing but sweat, feeling like a useless witness. They got him onto a board. They loaded him into the ambulance. The lights began flashing, bright and harsh, against the summer afternoon. The siren started, and for a moment it sounded wrong in a vacation town, where sirens usually mean drunk tourists or a fender bender, not a child falling 4 stories. The ambulance pulled away, and the sound faded down the street. We were left standing in the parking lot with a stain on the pavement that no amount of sun could make look normal. The adrenaline drained out of me so quickly I thought I might collapse. My legs felt weak. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. The air still smelled like summer, and that somehow made it worse, like the world was insisting on normalcy when something unthinkable had just happened. Steve and I walked back to the laser tag center in a kind of numb silence. Inside, the arcade lights blinked and the machines played their cheerful sounds as if they had no idea what was happening outside. We were supposed to put on uniforms and smile at customers, and the thought of it felt almost insulting. We tried. We were useless. We moved like people underwater. Later, I found out the boy didn't make it. He died from his injuries. I didn't ask his name. I didn't look it up in the news. At the time, I thought that distance would protect me. I thought that if I didn't attach details, if I didn't make him real beyond the moment, I could file it away as something awful that happened and then ended. I thought I could treat it like a nightmare you forget by lunchtime, but that didn't happen. It didn't fade. If anything, the lack of his name became its own kind of weight. He stayed in my mind as the boy, the kid on the railing, the child calling out for Jesus, the body on the asphalt. He became a loop of images and sounds without the normal human anchors that might have let me process him as a full person. Now, looking back, I regret that choice. I wish I knew who he was. I wish I had honored him as more than the worst moment of his life. I wish I had something to hold on to besides the horror. People asked afterward if I could have done anything. That question haunted me more than the ones that came from my own guilt. Could you have yelled? Could you have run over? Could you have warned someone? Could you have stopped it? Logic says no. I was separated by a fence and bushes. I was at work, not supervising children. I didn't know him. I didn't know his family. I didn't even know what apartment he belonged to. Even if I had screamed, "Get down." Kids don't always listen and adults don't always react in time. But guilt doesn't care about logic. Guilt is stubborn. It digs into the smallest moments and turns them into evidence. May I still replay that day and see the seconds where I looked at Steve instead of looking up. I see the moment I tried to shake off my fear. I hear Steve telling me to stop being paranoid. And I wonder, even knowing it's irrational, if speaking out louder would have changed anything. If moving faster would have mattered. If my body's certainty was some warning I failed to use properly. The sound of that thud lives in me. It is the worst sound I have ever heard. Sometimes I hear something heavy drop in real life. A suitcase, a watermelon, a piece of furniture, and my body reacts before my mind does. My stomach flips. My skin goes cold. My muscles tense like they're bracing for the rest of the memory to follow. I also hear the boy's voice sometimes, calling out for Jesus, and the aunt's voice accusing me. And those two sounds blend together in my mind into something I can't easily separate. Desperation and misunderstanding, innocence and rage, in tragedy and the ugly chaos around it. That summer was supposed to be about fun and freedom and feeling grown up. It turned into the summer I learned how quickly life can change, how fragile bodies are, how helpless you can be even when you are trying your hardest. Steve and I showed up early to play arcade games and toss a rubber ball around. We thought we were just waiting for our shift to start. Instead, we watched a child fall, and nothing about the world has felt fully casual since.